This one Chinese company is really scary. Even the Pentagon, FBI, and CIA are all on edge. This company is so powerful that even a country as strong as America had to change its laws and rally all its European partners to block their access to global technology. For what purpose? Just one, to take down this one company. And the company isn't TikTok, it's not Alibaba, but Huawei. Chinese technology company Huawei. Huawei. But Huawei is something very dangerous. You see what they've done from a security perspective, from a military perspective, it's very dangerous. Very dangerous. Very dangerous. America isn't afraid of Xiaomi, they don't care about Oppo or Vivo. But when the name Huawei comes up, suddenly every government agency in America panics, or at least gets really tense. The question is why? If this was just about selling cheap phones, there's no way America would be this paranoid, right? If it was just a matter of market competition, there's no way it would lead to a global boycott, right? What makes it scary is this: Huawei has been shot down over and over again. First, they were cut off from Google services. They were banned from buying chips. Their CFO was detained. But in 2024 to 2025, not only are they still alive, they've come back as a monster even scarier than before. After being hit with so many problems a few years ago, in 2024, their turnover was nearly 800 trillion. And this year, they became the #1 smartphone brand in China again, beating Vivo, Xiaomi, and even Apple. And there's something that, in my opinion, should have been impossible. We all know Apple is the king of smartwatches. But just a few months ago, Huawei overtook Apple's dominance in smartwatches. But I'm sure most of you didn't know that. You probably thought Huawei was just a smartphone or gadget company. If true, they wouldn't deserve to be called the most dangerous company in the West. A critical question is, how is that possible? They were taken down but came back stronger. This company, quote-unquote, dares to risk it all. But I'll talk about that in the next chapter. The first secret is they subscribe. No one wants to be left out if they subscribe or not. But let's move on to chapter 1. This is the most important context you need to understand. Because in 2019, Donald Trump issued what's called an executive order. Basically, Huawei was put on what's called the entity list. There's a document, a list of companies that are definitely banned. For the entire tech industry, this entity list is like a death note. It's a death sentence. A death sentence. Why do I call it a death sentence? Because in the modern tech world, there isn't a single electronics company that can survive without America. For example, if we want to make a smartphone, we need the Android OS, which belongs to Google, an American company. If we want the phone to be smarter, we need a chipset, right? Intel, Qualcomm, Nvidia, all American technology. Even if you want to manufacture your own chips in Taiwan, the printing machines use American technology. That's how strong their technological dominance is. When they say cut, it should be game over for Huawei, because there's a precedent. I'm sure many of you already know there's another Chinese company called ZTE. In 2018, they were hit with similar sanctions from the US. Within weeks, they collapsed and went bankrupt. Their operations came to a complete halt. In the end, they had to beg the US, pay trillions in fines, and only then were they allowed to reopen. They survived, but barely crawling. It made sense that people thought Huawei would end up the same way. At that time, their phone sales outside China, including immediately plummeted. It was as simple as not having Google Play and other services. Right? Back then, if you wanted to buy a Huawei phone, you definitely thought twice, why isn't there a Play Store? And in the end, they lost about $30 billion a year from their phone business. That's equivalent to wiping out GoTo's valuation many times over. But here's the thing, they didn't die because America miscalculated. They thought Huawei was a gadget company, when in fact, gadgets are just the surface. There's an even scarier monster behind the products you see every day: infrastructure. This is actually the main reason why America is afraid. Huawei holds the keys to the internet. People think Huawei is competing with Samsung and Apple. That's wrong. On a fundamental level, Huawei's real competitors are Cisco, Ericsson, and Nokia. They control the largest telecommunications infrastructure in the world. This is something most people don't know. But just imagine, it's like Apple is selling the car, the iPhone. Google sells the fuel or the map, which is Android. Huawei is the one building the highways. They hold 30% of the global telecommunications equipment market share. From 4G and 5G towers in Germany, the UK, Africa, all the way to Indonesia. Because if we look at the data, about 60 to 70% depend on Huawei. If you're watching this on your phone and using a signal, chances are the equipment is using Huawei. When we talk about 5G, Huawei holds the most 5G patents in the world. More than 20% of standard 5G patents belong to them. What does that mean? Even if the US builds its 5G network using Nokia or Ericsson, they still have to pay royalties to Huawei. And their biggest fear is espionage or spying. That's always been a classic issue ever since the days of TikTok, guys. The US is the most protectionist. Their logic goes like this. If Huawei controls the infrastructure, Beijing or China could tap into global data at any time or even shut down another country's internet. Although, to be fair, up until now, the US hasn't. Is there even any concrete evidence that Huawei actually spies? But yeah, in the world of geopolitics, capability is enough to trigger fear. Not doing it, but being able to do it is already scary. And behind all that, it's possible that this one company could change the entire order of global technology. Before we get there, let's think for a moment. How can a single company have such insane control over infrastructure and still survive after being hit so many times? The answer isn't in the technology. This is what people mean when they say Huawei is a so-called daredevil company. The secret lies in the mentality and the warlike culture within Huawei itself. The wolf culture. Huawei's greatest strength isn't in its tools, but in its mentality. Its founder, Ren Zhengfei, was a former military engineer in China. When he built this company, he instilled a work culture known as the wolf culture, aggressive, fearless, and highly loyal. If we bring it down to much smaller companies, that mentality is just as important. It's actually a foundation built from brains and systems. A team isn't just about adding more people and making the structure bulkier. That's why, at the big corporate level, they even develop their own software, or at least partially do so. Use a third-party system so that all the data and business processes are unified and can be controlled. I'm currently collaborating with a modern ERP software that's complete, all-in-one, easy to use, affordable, and integrated. This one software is used by a lot of companies. It's called Odoo. They're even confident enough to call themselves the easiest business management app for unifying sales, inventory, finance, and business operations in one organized system. And for those who are curious and want to know more, early next year there will be an event called Odoo Days. It's the biggest Odoo event in Asia Pacific, happening on January 21st, 2026. I'll also be a speaker there, and I'm 100% sure that Huawei must have a similar system to organize everything. Now, back to the topic. The difference between Huawei and other tech companies, if you look at Apple, Microsoft, and the others, they're all public companies. But the real highlight doesn't stop there. All those crazy bets, the hundreds of trillions spent on research, paid off at a crucial moment. The moment when the whole world realized through a single Huawei phone launch that the American sanctions no longer worked. America no longer had any power here. It's called the Mate 60 moment. This happened at the end of 2023. The US Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, was visiting China. As she landed, Huawei, without any prior announcement, released a new phone, the Mate 60 Pro. You might be wondering, what's so unique about this phone? I remember this phone had been launched before, but people in the tech world were absolutely shocked. Because when the phone was taken apart, inside was a Kirin 9000S chip, a 7nm chip made in China by SMIC, designed by Huawei and supporting 5G. This was a huge slap in the face for the US, because the purpose of the US sanctions was to keep Chinese technology stuck in the Stone Age. They wanted China to depend on Qualcomm chips, Snapdragon chips, back when China could only make 14nm or maybe 28nm chips, but Huawei proved they could make advanced chips without US equipment. Instead of killing Huawei, the US sanctions actually forced them to create vertical integration. They used to buy chips from Qualcomm, now they make their own. They used to use Android, now they have Harmony OS, which will soon be completely independent from Android. They used to use chip design software from the US, now they make their own. Why is this impressive? Because Huawei is the only company in the world that has an end-to-end ecosystem. This is on par with Apple. When you talk about Apple's ecosystem, from hardware, software, connectivity, plus infrastructure like towers, cloud, OS, even Apple doesn't have that tower infrastructure. Because building an ecosystem is extremely difficult. Everything has to be integrated, every decision has to be made based on data. If a giant like Huawei is doing it, then smaller businesses should do it too. Playing the long-term game means we have to do things that are boring over the long run, tidying up systems, data, and operations. That's why I mentioned Odoo earlier, a modern ERP that's now widely used by businesses as the brain of their operations. I really like collaborating with them because I've personally used their software for my clients. So instead of using 5 or 6 disconnected tools, imagine with Odoo, sales, inventory, finance, and even projects are all integrated into one ecosystem. When you're making a 3-year strategy like this, you just need one click and the report comes out instantly and accurately for you to make plans for next year. This is what I like about their execution. The features are made modular. So small businesses can start with 1 or 2 apps, the subscription price is much cheaper, and only add more features if needed. Now, this is the most practical step for small companies who want to take inspiration from Huawei. Before thinking big, tidy up your systems and internal processes first. Okay, now let's get back to the topic. Because Huawei's story doesn't stop here. when their minds started to seep into other arenas. This is why I said this company could change the landscape of the tech world, because they're going to enter electric cars all the way to the AI ecosystem. Now, this is a new arena for a giant electric cars, but their strategy is smart. Huawei doesn't build car factories like Xiaomi making their own cars. They realize that making cars has thin margins and is exhausting, so they use the Huawei Insight strategy. The analogy is like Intel Insight in laptops. Their vision is to sell autonomous driving systems to all electric cars in China. Or if it's Tesla, it's called FSD. From smart cabins, LiDAR sensors, to car factories like Ceres, Chery, Chang'an. And interestingly, according to many reviews, if you compare it head-to-head with Tesla, which claims to be #1 in the world, Huawei can actually be even smoother than Tesla because it's tailored to the roads and traffic in China. How is that possible? Again, it's because they have the infrastructure. Huawei cars can communicate with traffic lights and smart roads, whose networks are also built by Huawei. So when you see that Huawei has expanded from chip networks to AI-powered cars, the story is no longer just about one company versus one country. The bigger story is about a shift or a battle for the direction of global technology. And what's even more interesting is which stand on. The key message from this whole story is actually the shift in global power. In the past, the US held absolute control. Anyone who opposed them was taken down. But Huawei proved that even after being taken out, they could come back to life and make America feel like their efforts were ineffective. This phenomenon is called technological decoupling. The world will eventually have two internet standards, two chip standards, two ecosystems, one for the Western Bloc and one for the Eastern Bloc. Actually right in the middle. A lot of our infrastructure uses Huawei, but when it comes to gadgets, our business orientation is still mostly elsewhere. At the very least, we shouldn't just be spectators. With Huawei's underdog mentality, or as a developing country, we need to be brave enough to do two things. First, dare to invest heavily in R&D. Pursue new research, not just piggybacking on others. And then, have an anti-fragile mindset, a wolf culture, and the courage to risk it all. That's what we need to emulate. Because in the future, the battle for power will be in the realm of tech sovereignty. Which country can shelter so many private companies to safeguard the future of technology? But that's just my opinion. What do you guys think? See you guys in the next video.